Ed was served at the American Bar Association, headquartered here in Chicago, from 1987 to 1999, when he joined the ACLU. And in that capacity, he implemented a lot of programs and communications for all the officers of the American Bar Association, which happens to be the largest professional organization that we know about in the States. So we're very happy to have Ed Yohnka here again. Let's give him a big welcome.
So good morning. Thank you, Don, for that introduction, and thank you for welcoming me back. I didn't speak out when you were asking for happy events, but as I've been sitting here, I've been struck by two, if you'll allow me a moment of personal privilege. First of all, in a month from today, I believe I'm eligible now to come back here every week because I will celebrate my 65th birthday. I'm going to keep working, so I doubt I'll be back every week, but maybe from time to time I will make it. The second thing, I actually have three, forgive me. I just wanted to check, how many of you would say that you consume news on a regular basis, a daily, a few times a week, et cetera? Okay, for those of you who have, I promise you can sit tight. There will be no references to childless cat ladies in this presentation this morning. And the last thing I want to say, which I actually told Colleen I was going to announce that. So anyway, and the last thing I want to, I just want to say is, you asked for happy announcements. I can't resist. My son and his partner recently informed my wife and I that we're going to be grandparents for the first time. I'd like to say I'm looking for tips. I have like 9 great nieces and nephews. I've gotten the hang of it by now, but still I've realized it's time to push all of those great nieces and nephews off to the side. And so I'm looking forward to that. Let me begin today. I wanted to do a couple different things as a beginning point today, because I thought, as I was thinking about coming back, and as Don said, I had come and talked about this topic a few months ago. I first of all wanted to say up front, which I think I failed to do the last time, that I realize that abortion rights and reproductive rights are matters and issues which garner fierce attention on both sides of the issue. And it is likely that at least one and maybe more of you in this audience might disagree with my particular perspective and the perspective of the ACLU. And I just want to say, I think that's okay. That doesn't make you an enemy. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you somebody who is not worthy of being heard. It is simply that we disagree. And I hope that you will understand that's certainly the perspective that I'm coming from. I think the other thing I wanted to do was to trace a little bit at the beginning, because this is something we don't do in this discussion, is trace a little bit about how we got here in terms of abortion rights in the United States and what the sort of the history of that is. And I want to begin just by saying something that maybe some of you will understand or know, that there were actually no laws that governed abortion or governed the provision of abortion or reproductive health care in the United States up until about the 1820s. And even when where those laws existed, they tended to be matters which simply which barred some form or some type of medication or poison or other things that was being used as an abortion, because people were concerned about the damage it did to the person who took it. So in other words, there wasn't really a recognition of any kind of governmental role in terms of people deciding whether or not to continue with a pregnancy, and certainly whether or not to continue with a pregnancy early in term. But then, as I say, beginning in the 1820s, states began to adopt some forms of regulation, some kinds of regulations around these. And this kind of movement towards really sort of evolved into bans or all-out bans. And those bans really sort of reached their zenith in the late 19th century, when a number of states actually adopted for the first time outright bans on abortion. And you may ask yourself, what were the factors that led to the adoption of these sorts of bans? What were some of the arguments that were being used? What was the kind of dialogue and discussion that was happening around this? And a scholar at the University of Illinois who's gone back and looked at a lot of the state legislative arguments around this and a lot of the material that accompanied these bans has identified, sort of three prevailing sort of factors. The first was a general sort of moral or sort of values question about whether or not abortion and abortion care ought to be legal in the United States. That was one, to be sure. But there were two others that I think are just sort of interesting to have as backdrop to think about the time frame in which many of these were adopted. And the first was it largely was described as an effort to forestall the growth in populations of immigrant populations in the United States. Groups, especially sort of Catholics from Europe who were coming to the United States and having large families, were seen as outpacing in terms of reproduction people who were here. And so therefore the argument was that abortion and access to abortion care ought to be limited. And then, it was interesting that even at that time, in just the beginnings of an awakening of a women's rights movement, that there were arguments that were made in some state legislatures, about the fact that abortion care shouldn't be provided and shouldn't be available because, after all, if women were compelled to have larger families, that they would not be interested in things like having the right to vote. Or in accessing education or other kinds of things. And so, that kind of thing at least began, those were parts of factors, but it really helped to kind of spread and organize efforts at creating bans. And those bans were largely in place in states all across the United States. This was not geographic. This was not this wasn't particularly North versus South or anything of that nature. Through a lot of the middle of the 20th century, when in some places abortion laws began to be relaxed and some of the bans began to be lessened and began to be removed. And you probably also won't be surprised to learn that efforts around ending abortion bans and striking, creating a broader access to reproductive health care really took off as part of the movement in the 1950s and into the 1960s around women's liberation, around civil rights movements, and around other kinds of general movements like that. There was a general trend in that direction. And if you think about that as a movement and as a social and a legal movement, especially, the movement was entirely successful in that it was, January of 1973 when the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade, in which the majority of the Supreme Court for the first time announced and recognized a constitutional right for someone to make a decision about terminating a pregnancy, especially in the first trimester, without any governmental interference. By the way, I don't want to steal your shtick, But does anybody in this room remember what happened on the same day that Roe was announced? There were actually two great historical things. LBJ died, and actually Henry Kissinger flew to Paris for the first time for the Vietnam peace talks. It's strange. I remember being a junior high school student and being on a bus coming back from like a basketball game and hearing the news and hearing all three of those things. And in any event, so what Roe really does is put in place a structure and a mechanism in which, as I say, states cannot interfere with a decision about a decision about terminating a pregnancy in the first trimester in any way, recognizing that there is a constitutional right to make private decisions about one's own life. In the second trimester, the government gets a little more of an interest and can put some regulations around it, can put some regs around the way in which that decision is made. And in the third trimester, the government is able to fully regulate that in terms of whether or not the care is available. And each state could make a decision for themselves on that. That is effectively what the structure of Roe is and is put in place. Almost instantly, as we know, there are opponents of the Roe decision. There are people who think it was wrongly decided. There are people who want to go back to the days when there were bans in every state across the union. And so one of the things that we see happen is that, if to use the phrase, anti-abortion forces or organizations began to find ways to try to test what regulations could be put around particular kinds of abortion care. And so what you see is things like a requirement that for a woman to have an abortion, they need to have permission from their husband. In order for someone to undergo treatment, they have to listen to a state written or state mandated lecture. Sometimes there were long waiting periods that required 48 hours between a first visit to a clinic and actually having the procedure. Sometimes there was a high level of repeated counseling that was required. So there were a range of things in that nature. And then the other thing that became a fixture during this time, or emerged as a fixture during this time, is that clinics were actually required under some state statutes to have what was the functional equivalent of a hospital in order to function as a clinic. The doors had to be as wide as a hospital. There had to be machinery or access to various machines that were put in place, and these were all designed in order to limit the number or the amount of care and abortion care that would be available in almost every state. And this kind of effort at limitation really comes to a crescendo in 1992 when the Supreme Court accepted and then decided a case called Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which took a look at sort of the regulatory scheme that had been created in the state of Pennsylvania and whether or not that scheme violated Roe v. Wade, and actually what the court ultimately took as a question as to whether or not Roe was still good law, whether or not it was in fact the law of the land. The court in that case, in a decision written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, rejected the argument that Roe should be reversed. Justice O'Connor noted that at that point in time in 92, that people across the country had become dependent upon, had relied upon in good faith, the idea that at least in the first trimester, they could make a decision for themselves without any governmental interference. And that given the fact that Roe was also a precedent of the Supreme Court, that precedent needed to be respected. So after Casey is decided, you essentially have a precedent created in Roe. You have it upheld in Casey, and we begin at this point to really see this constitutional right upheld, but we also begin to see, I think, the first inklings of the court allowing certain kinds of regulations, certain kinds of guidelines by the government that begin to shrink access in many states. So you see across the country, there becomes this split that we hadn't seen before, where in some states, access to reproductive health care is more widely available than it is in other states as the result of the regulations that particular states have put in place. And in each year, not each year, but in each few years, states effectively try to up the ante. They try to come up with different kinds of regulations, creating higher hurdles, creating additional burdens in order to test cases in court and to see if, in fact, there is the possibility that they can convince the Supreme Court at some point to overturn the Roe decision and therefore reverse the notion or eliminate the recognition of the constitutional right to fundamental abortion care across the country without governmental interference. And after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the former president of the United States having the third appointment to the Supreme Court, having declared that he would appoint justices who were opposed to Roe, a case which had been moving through the courts, Dobbs versus Whole Women's Health, comes to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in that instance, it is worth noting that the question in Dobbs initially was not whether or not Roe should be reversed, but whether or not Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, which had created a 12-week ban, could in fact enforce that ban under the rigors of the Roe guidance that had been issued in 1973. After Justice Ginsburg dies, Justice Barrett Coney is appointed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, the state of Mississippi actually asked the Supreme Court to decide a different question. They asked the Supreme Court to decide not whether or not their law is constitutional, but whether or not the right recognized in Roe is constitutional. And as you know, in the Dobbs case in June of 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States, after 50 years, reverses its decision in just a few sentences, quite candidly, and rejects the idea that there is a fundamental right under the Constitution for someone to decide whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term. And that's where we find ourselves in June of 2022. So where are we today, and where do we see ourselves going in the future? So the first thing to note is that there are now 14 states across the country that have an absolute ban on any abortion care. That includes large states, including Texas and the state of Florida. It also includes states in the Midwest like Iowa or Missouri, Indiana, and I said it, Iowa, which just began to implement their total ban yesterday. 4 states are enforcing a 6-week ban, which is generally recognized as a period of time in which most women actually do not even know that they're pregnant yet. And the result of that is is that 3 out of 10 women in the United States now live in a state where there is an abortion ban. So if they need reproductive health care of any kind, they cannot find it in their home states. That's led to, I think, something that one could anticipate out of that 1 in 5 patients seeking care, and this has been true at clinics across Illinois, now have to travel from their home state. And I do think it's important to recognize that 1 in 5 figure contemplates only the one person who is able actually to economically travel from one state to another in order to do that. And this is no small feat. In Illinois, just for example, in the last few months, clinics in Illinois have seen patients from as far away as Florida, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama. It's not an easy trip for many people. And given the fact that their reason for maybe not expanding a family may well be economic, it makes it even more complicated in terms of what's happening. There's a second thing I think we're seeing out of this and out of the split that's happening in states, which is even in states where they've instituted a total ban on abortion care, we are also seeing a lot of questions and an impact on more broad health care related to pregnancy and parenting. So, for example, first of all, I think, number one, you probably all know that pregnancy is a difficult thing. I say that as a 65-year-old white man. But pregnancy is a complicated thing. And the truth is that there are many complications in pregnancy wherein I'm sure all of us know someone in our family or in our friend group or in our circle who has suffered consequences late in a pregnancy, sometimes resulting in a tragedy of losing a child that was very much wanted by a particular family. And in those instances, one of the standards of medical care is often to do effectively an abortion in order to ensure that the woman's ability, both her health and her ability for future fertility is protected. Because doctors don't know precisely what the outcome might be trying to carry that pregnancy to term. They make a very difficult determination with the family. Often families consult, family members consult religious leaders, et cetera, in making those decisions. The problem is that even in states where these bans exist and where they have carve-outs to protect the life or health of the mother, those carve-outs are written in such a fashion that it is often complicated for doctors to know when they can provide medical care to their patients without risking their own license. And so you have examples like in Texas, where there's been a lot of litigation around this issue, where women are sent away from an emergency room bleeding and told to go sit in the parking lot until they've bled X amount, and then doctors will see them to consider whether or not ending a pregnancy may be the most appropriate thing. And although doctors have testified and affirmed the fact that, they aren't sure what to do, while general counsel at hospitals in states like Texas and Idaho and other places have said that they just aren't sure how to advise their clients in order to ensure that their clients are not affected by laws or risk prosecution. In states, especially in Texas, the Supreme Court of Texas has literally said somebody else can decide how that works, or it's in the moment. We can't decide this here from the bench, leaving people in this limbo where they are often unsure about what to do. And that's having a different impact. And it really is, I think, worth noting, which is that OBGYNs are leaving the practice in many instances, but they are also leaving states where these bans occur or are in place. And it has a detrimental effect, which I think we can all recognize, but just to name it, that not only does it mean that someone who needs a termination or desires a termination can't have access to that, but that in fact, people who just need basic OBGYN healthcare may not have someone with the experience, with the training, and with the knowledge that they need in order to provide that care during a pregnancy, which is just difficult rather than complicated. And I think that is an impact that we're going to see spread over many years. There is on this issue a secondary matter which the Supreme Court took up this year that some of you may have heard about. Just to mention this, there is a federal law called EMTALA. It's the emergency medical, and then there's a bunch of other words, and I always forget where they are, and so I'm not going to try. But under EMTALA, if one receives federal funds of any kind, and most healthcare facilities around the country do through Medicare and Medicaid, they have to provide emergency care to patients that is consistent with the standard of medical care. And again, in some instances, that standard of care is terminating a pregnancy in order to preserve the life and the health of the mother. And what's happening is that some states have argued to the Supreme Court, and there's two different cases that are going. There was a case from Idaho that came to the Supreme Court in which the state said this federal rule interferes with our abortion ban, and so therefore it should not be enforced. For those of you who are lawyers or have legal training, there used to be something known as federal supremacy that sometimes doesn't seem to be in place with this particular Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, looked at this case, decided that it wasn't really ripe for decision by the Supreme Court, and they set it back down. But what happened was, as a result of that, there was a case from Texas working its way up in which the Fifth Circuit had not allowed for emergency care to begin or to continue to be provided while the courts were deciding this case. And so in Texas, a large state with thousands of people pregnant every day, you're having this experience where the availability of emergency care is really quite limited. The second area that we're seeing, and I think we're again, this is sort of evolving day by day, is the issue of medication and abortions. In 2023, about 2/3, it was about 63 or 64% of all abortions were medication abortions and not surgical abortions. So in this instance, you again are probably aware that looking at that number, looking at the impact that has, folks have challenged medication abortions in a couple of different ways. The first is that there was a direct challenge by an organization of emergency room doctors that was formed in a small town down in Texas, where they filed a lawsuit claiming that the 1999 approval of mifepristone by the Federal Drug Administration did not follow appropriate guidelines and therefore should be reversed so that mifepristone should not be available on the market. A district court judge in Texas agreed with them, sent it to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit three-court judge panel agreed in part with them, said that they weren't going to overturn the 1999 regulations, but did say that they were going to overturn more recent regulations that have made mifepristone more widely available through telemedicine and other kinds of things. So again, would really limit the capacity of people who were forced to travel or lived in a state with a ban. It would affect them in terms of that. The Supreme Court heard that case, sat on it for a few months, and then ultimately decided that the group of physicians who had brought the case in the first instance didn't really have standing. They were not actually injured by mifepristone having been approved back in 1999. And so they sent the case back to the district court with instructions to dismiss it. I will tell you now there are efforts underway by states, attorneys general in states that have these 14 states that have the abortion bans to intervene in that case under the argument that the availability of mifepristone runs counter to their abortion bans and therefore they should have standing to challenge the law. And so that's the second thing. That's one way that we're seeing this attack is through these direct attacks. But the second way that we are seeing attacks on medication abortion is a little bit of a sub rosa attack through something called the Comstock Act. I'm going to do a moment of audience participation again. If I ask you, how many of you here have heard of Project 2025? All right, so a number of you. Project 2025 is a policy document that was created by a group of think tanks in Washington. It is intended to be, and this often happens, there's nothing nefarious about it in any way, shape, or form. It is intended to be kind of a blueprint or a playbook for a new administration in terms of the kinds of things that these groups would like to see. And so Project 2025 has gotten a lot of attention. It is a very conservative document, I think it's fair to say. And it does a couple of different things. One is it really leans into the idea that the presidency is all powerful and unitary and able to control a variety of things. That's one of the arguments that they make. But one of the other arguments that is interesting, I think, in this context is that the Project 2025 and people who have been involved in that project have suggested that they needn't pass a nationwide abortion ban in a new conservative administration, that rather what they can do is simply enforce the 1857 Comstock Act. And the 1857 Comstock Act barred any materials from being sent through the mail or sold nationally that would either be pornographic in nature or alternately, as it's being interpreted, would in any way, shape, or form advance, help, assist in the performance of abortion care. So, for example, in addition to medications, it would bar the sales of equipment that's used in abortion care anywhere across the country. So not only would you affect where there were abortion bans in place in those 14 states and the other 4 that have the 6-week bans, but you would in fact then also put in place the inability of people from Michigan or Illinois or other places in order to stop them from providing care to their patients, because you would bar them the medical materials and implements in order to do that. So those two threats, both to medication abortion through the direct challenge and through the Comstock Act, is something that's hanging out there, and I think is something that we could well see in a new administration in a few years. In other ways, I think this issue of mifepristone in particular will be back before the Supreme Court in a couple of years. And the last thing that I want to mention, because this is the beginnings of, I think, an effort you'll see in Louisiana recently. There's a case in Arizona also that will, I think, be moving up through the federal courts. There's actually a challenge to any kind of reproductive health care, particularly abortion care, under the idea or notion that a fetus is a person, and therefore any kind of abortion care is murder. That was essentially what the Alabama Supreme Court found in the case which blocked IVF in that state. It is being challenged in other ways in order to challenge abortion care, access to mifepristone, access to other kinds of care. I think those are things that we are going to see in the future as well. And, you know, there are in some of the concurrences around Dobbs and some of the discussions around these issues, there are some justices of the Supreme Court of the United States who clearly are at least interested in exploring the idea of whether or not a fetus is a person for purposes of protection under the Constitution. So that is a little bit of where we stand. I'm going to cover one more area, and I'm going to I'm just going to acknowledge that I don't think this is actually my area of expertise, but you know, they gave me a microphone, so go figure. And that is a little bit of the political landscape around this. And I think in two ways that at least we should acknowledge in terms of where we are around this fight right now. And the first is that abortion and Roe has broadly always enjoyed popular support. That is, it's a majority of people in the United States were never for overturning Roe v. Wade. Those numbers for reestablishing Roe and that framework are higher today than they've ever been in the history of the polling around the issue. More people, now that the right has been taken away, are interested in protecting it as they see other outcomes from it, are concerned about it. And so you begin to see that kind of movement or shift in public opinion as a result. And that is reflected itself largely in a lot of the referenda that have happened around the country on this issue. You'll recall that after the decision in Dobbs in June, there was a rush and there was a constitutional amendment considered in Kansas, a deeply conservative state, in August of 2022, which asked the question of whether or not the Kansas Constitution should protect the access to reproductive health care and abortion care in particular. That referenda was scheduled, as I say, on a Tuesday in August, thinking it would have a low voter turnout and there would be an overwhelming conservative majority that would turn out. It had exactly the opposite effect. There was a huge turnout, and the effort to end abortion in Kansas was defeated. Recently, we've seen referenda in Kentucky. We saw one in Michigan. Probably a lot of you saw or paid attention to the referenda recently in Ohio, in which there was first an effort to change to pass a constitutional amendment that changed the threshold for how much support a constitutional amendment needed to be adopted. So they had to defeat the procedural vote in order to get to the question about abortion rights, and the abortion rights side won that one by a margin of about 56 to 44 percent in terms of the vote. Again, in a state which has been increasingly conservative and governed in that fashion. And, you know, we also obviously are seeing that this fight is very, very much a part of the debate, whether it's at the presidential level or the statewide level in a state like Illinois, or certainly even down to, you know, state legislature races across the country in a whole range of ways. And so I would just close by saying that you know, there I think two things. First, I think there was and there is this desire to suggest that overturning Roe simply left these questions to the states, and that each state could decide for themselves what they want to do. But we're seeing the signs that there are efforts to move beyond that and create national bans in one form or another on particular kinds of abortion care. And the second thing I think we are seeing is something that you know, I think most of us know, which is that there is a fierce political interest often in protecting rights that have already been granted. Will close by just one of my favorite moments from my 25 years at the ACLU was during a debate about whether or not in Illinois we ought to try to pass a civil union bill or just go straight to equal marriage for gay and lesbian couples. An old-time politician was sitting in the room, and there was a fierce argument among groups about it. You know, some said, let's go straight to marriage. Others thought, let's get these protections for people under civil unions first, and et cetera. And this senator stood up and he walked to the door and he turned around. He said, I work in the state legislature. My job is to give you things. I don't take things away. So once I give something, I'm not going to take it back. And if I do take it back, I'm not going to be reelected. And his final thing was just, you all decide what you want to do and come back and tell me. But I raised that because it is fascinating to see, once the right has been taken away, the fierce response that has come. And so I think this fight is far from over. You know, we have put in protections in Illinois in a variety of different ways. And I think we know that, you know, those will be tested in different ways as we go along. But I think at the end of the day, and I'm more acutely aware of this, to go back to where I started, as I think about, you know, the fact that I'm about to become a grandfather, I am acutely aware that, you know, my son's partner lives in a state where she will get quality care throughout the entirety of her pregnancy, no matter what happens. And I think that's worth fighting for. So thank you very much.
I just have one question, and that is using good words to effectively communicate, I think, is important. And I think the word that is more important than the word abortion is women's rights. And that is the thing that is not seen, or it's not really discussed. But I think that word has much more power if it's used effectively. Correct me if I'm wrong. So what's interesting was I have done this work, as you heard, for a long, long time. And I used to be able to write an email to our members and supporters about abortion rights without ever using the word abortion. I was always proud of that. People could know what it was, but I never used that word. What's interesting is in today's environment, actually people want to know what you're doing about abortion. They don't want to think that you aren't fighting to protect abortion rights if you say women's rights. So it's upended a little of all of the things that I learned over any number of years.
I'm on the heels of what he just said. I would like to say that the word abortion is from the Latin, which means literally to jump ship. And I think we all have a right to jump out of an airplane or a boat that's going down. I also noted that you never mentioned the awful. Oh, thank you. I also wanted to mention that you never mentioned the idea of women becoming pregnant due to incest or rape. Thirdly, I would like, I'm sitting back here with lots of ideas. I do want to share something with this group. In 1969, my husband and I became pregnant with our first child. We were extremely happy about this. I was living in Munich, Germany at the time, working for the military during the Vietnam War. At 7 months, my baby stopped growing under my heart. I went to the Army doctor and he said, "Your baby is not alive." He said, "You have a choice." He said, "You can either carry that baby for the 9 months or we can take it from you." And I said, "I don't want to carry a dead body under my heart. Besides, I could have gotten very, very sick. Something very serious could have happened to me." There was no question when this happened. I still live with the memory of that. In today's world, in some states, I would be put in jail or the doctor would be put in jail. So I just want you to know what has ensued.
If I can just say a word, I didn't mention rape or incest, and I acknowledge that in many states some of the bans include exceptions for that and carry all kinds of things that someone has to do to prove it. But one of the things that worries me is when we talk about those instances, as horrific as they are, they may not be any more or less horrific than somebody who just can't carry a child or can't have another child. And I've never liked the idea of getting into sort of the good abortion versus the bad abortion. And so I take your point. It's a personal preference with me in many ways.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple of things I wanted to, I ask one question and I have something I'd like to share. First of all, what do you think of the term pro-life? I feel that it should be used as anti-abortion, because what happens after the child is born? They don't care then what happens. And I'm wondering if you agree with that. So I will share something very personal. I have a 57-year-old daughter. So now you know I'm old. And when she was 17 years old, she became pregnant the first time she ever had a sexual experience with another boy. My advice to her at that time, when she confided in me in tears, was don't tell him. I was so afraid that his family would get involved and she wouldn't be allowed to abort. I was very lucky because Roe versus Wade was, at that time, the law. So she had an abortion very quickly. And I will tell you that now she is an escort at the Downers Grove abortion clinic. She works very hard taking women from all over. A lot come from Indiana.
Yeah.
And they come from all over. And in the beginning, I was really worried about her because I was afraid she'd be attacked. And she said there were tremendous protests out there, mostly men that were protesting. And now she said the protests have calmed down. It's not so much, but there are still tons of women coming to Illinois for this. And I'm very proud of my daughter for what she does.
Yeah. Let me say.
And I will tell you, she has 2 wonderful children now.
Good.
And a very happy marriage.
Yeah. Oh, good. And so let me just say, in terms of your in terms of your statement about pro-life and that thing, it would be better for you if Colleen was here today because she would completely agree with you. I'll just say, I think people ought to be able to label themselves in the way they want to. I think you also have every right in the world to point out what you see as what's wrong with that or hypocrisy or things you disagree with. But to me, like naming who other people are, I don't speak for them. I speak for myself, and I'm okay with whatever term they want to use. We know what the end goal of the policy is. That's what's really more important than anything.
I personally know well the chief of gynecology at the University of Tennessee. And she has explained to me, if a patient comes in and is hemorrhaging on the verge of death, she has to go find 5 colleagues that will support her to be able to abort that pregnancy. And if she can't find them, she has to make that decision, and she could go to jail for doing that.
Yeah, it's for many providers, it is truly a frightening moment. And again, I think, back to the point here, what one worries about is people being driven out of the work of providing care for everyone as a result of these laws. And we don't do this with other areas of medical care, which is the other part of it, I think, that's concerning.
So when I was in college, I had 2 different roommates who both ended up getting pregnant the first time with their boyfriends, and one went to Mexico, one went to New York, and both had, abortions with hangers essentially, and came back bleeding and et cetera, et cetera. My question to you though is, what are the test cases for people where the religions, like for instance, in Judaism, a fetus is not a person until it's born? Has there been any ruling on that?
There actually is a case that was filed in Florida after they implemented, I think it was first their 6-week ban, in which a lower court judge has ruled that it's a violation of religious liberty to enforce that law against people whose religious viewpoint is obviously at odds with the law. That case has gone up to the 11th Circuit. It seems to be moving slowly because I've never heard about what's happening in terms of the briefing around that. I think that you're right that when you start to put bans in place, when, I think as an example, again, this is in state court, but when the Alabama Supreme Court's decision around IVF was sort of characterized in religious terms, I think that these kinds of challenges are going to become more regular and be more prevalent as we go on. But I know that one at least does exist and is sort of moving along in the states right now.
And looking for questions from Zoom. We've had a nice audience there too. But I have a question, a big picture question. And you guys get involved in that, I know. We're one nation, but we're very divided. In essence, we've got 2 sides that look at each other not on the same team. So my question is, how do we get back to disagreeing in ways that lead to resolutions of big issues instead of demonizing each other? How does you guys get involved in helping in that? Or do we give you another hour?
Yeah, I probably need at least another hour. Let me just say, I think about this question a lot. In part, and I think I told this story the last time I was here. My brother, before he passed away, and our political viewpoints diverged, but it didn't mean we couldn't sit down and have dinner and talk about our family and talk about, how wrong he was. No. And talk about those things. And I think part of it is there is there is an othering of people that we do when they disagree with us that is not helpful to this. And I think we have, I think that we have decided somehow that if somebody doesn't agree with us fully, then all of them is wrong, right? I do a lot of work around criminal legal system stuff. I don't believe that anybody is as bad as the worst thing they've ever done. I don't believe anybody is as bad as the worst thing they might believe in politics. And if we, to me, it seems like we have to figure out ways to find those common grounds. I would like to think, because it has been the sort of the guidepost of my adult life, that our Constitution is part of the way that we do that, that there's an agreed upon sense of what that document means. That feels like it's slipping away in ways that make me worry for, what happens into the future. And so, I'm always reminded of something someone once said to me, about the fact that when there's a tornado, I grew up in a small rural town. When somebody got sick and their crops were in the field, nobody asked if they were Republican or Democrat. They just went and helped them. And I think that, I always think of the people who say on September 12th, none of us were Republicans or Democrats, right? We were just one country. And, and I think that somehow we have to find ways back to that, hopefully without the disasters, that let us tap into that spirit and not be sort of give in to our worst instincts about that. The last thing I'll just say, and I say this hesitantly, but I think it's important in the question that you asked. I have never thought in all of my years that this country was perfect. It is why I devoted the last 40 years of my life to try to make it better in the way that I saw fit. There are others who are working just as hard to make it better in their notion in ways that are completely antithetical to what I do. That's the way this ought to work. We ought to have a great debate about those things. But I think the idea somehow that there's one way in which the country either is or isn't good is something that really does worry me. This is the hardest question of all, I can tell.
Well, there's a reason this country is referred to as the Great Experiment, and I think we're proving that on a daily basis. Personal aside too is that when we get into a heated conversation like this, or right versus left, and things start to get hot and heavy, I have a great conversation ender, which I use quite frequently. Well, I shouldn't frequently. I don't get involved in those things too much anymore, but when I do, and you get to this fevered pitch, just say, how about them Bears?